Today we'll talk about the heirs of Rome, and that's chapter 9 in the text. The heirs of Rome were the Byzantine Empire as it came to be known, Islamic civilization as it spreads out from the 7th century onwards, and then Europe, and the rise of the state, the rise of the Frankish state in particular, but nevertheless is sort of at least the beginning of recovery a little bit, beginning roughly in the 6th century and 7th century onwards. So first let's talk about the Byzantine Empire. What we want to talk about really is to what extent, why does Europe emerge from sort of the chaos, let's just say the chaos left behind by the disasters that happened to Rome in the 5th century. Why does Europe, after all is said and done over the next 4 or 5 centuries, recover? And eventually, it's Europe that creates the modern world, that gives the world science, technology, intellectual development, many ideas. That doesn't mean that there weren't many ideas that came out of the Byzantine Empire, or for that matter, Islamic civilization, because that would not be true. Both were actually very dynamic in their own ways and preserved the ancient culture that could otherwise have been lost. But it's Europe in the end that is able to thrive and is able to dominate to some extent, and is able finally to develop, stabilize everything, develop into sort of the liberal democratic institutions that we're so familiar with, as well as the scientific revolution and the development of technological prowess and so on and so on. So let's go, however, first to the Byzantine Empire and what the Byzantines were able to accomplish. The Byzantine Empire was actually the Eastern Roman Empire. And after the collapse of Rome, in the 5th century and at the beginning of the 6th century, really the Byzantine Empire is what is left. And by then, of course, the seat of the empire had already moved to Byzantium, as it was called, and that would be the ancient city of Constantinople, which is today Istanbul. Byzantium actually was a very dynamic society, so why does it thrive when Rome is collapsing? Well, for one thing, the German invasions, the various invasions, went to the west, to the west. To some extent, yes, they were bought off by the Byzantine leaders, by the emperors, and they had still quite a bit of wealth that they could use, and they bought off the tribes, and those went further to the west, eventually sacking Rome, excuse me, and eventually conquering much of Europe, including England. So what was it about the Byzantine Empire, however, that was able to be so dynamic? Well, for one thing, it never went through all the chaos that Rome did. It remained fairly stable. It remained quite rich. It didn't go through the depopulation, for example, that Rome was experiencing. Its cities continued to thrive. Trade was still very active and very dynamic. Perhaps that was because of its situation, where it was located. Population density remained pretty good. And the urban areas remained pretty strong, mainly because trade really didn't diminish very much there. So the Byzantine Empire is actually going to thrive. And because of that, it also thrives. Well, there are several unifying forces. One of them was Christianity itself. The other was Greek culture, which is inherited, as well as the Greek language. So there are several things which help unify the Byzantine Empire. And also, of course, the heritage, the entire heritage of the Greeks remains pretty strong there. And the Byzantines will encourage that. They'll encourage that. We've already given the example before of Alexandria, but you'll find the attempt to preserve some of the ancient ideas, science, for example, and there's a certain amount of continuity that stretches out there. So the Byzantine Empire actually is very dynamic, and it manages to continue going for some time, and it is, you might say, the seat of sort of Western civilization, Western culture at this point. Well, perhaps it would have continued. Perhaps it would have been the most dynamic sector after all. Things work out a little bit differently in the Byzantine Empire, and that's because the states simply remain strong. So secular rulers, the emperors, they remain strong, and they're able to put their stamp on Christianity, so that the Eastern Orthodox Church, which emerges from this, will more or less be in sync with the state and will, to a large extent, be dominated by the state. That's the difference between what's going to happen in Europe and what's happening to the Byzantine Empire. Nevertheless, the Byzantine Empire comes to some grief because of a number of invasions beginning in the 11th century. The Turks The Seljuk Turks, the first Turks to actually come through the region, began also to already sort of knock at the door, and they began to invade certain areas of the Byzantine Empire, which at this point actually includes much of what is now the Middle East, and of course Greece, what is now Greece, and generally the Middle East though. So the Turks come, and then shortly after them, the 11th and 12th century, the Turks are coming. Soon after that, the 13th century, the Mongols began to knock on the door, and of course later on the Ottoman Turks also are there, and in fact they will conquer much of what is left of the Ottoman Empire by then. And by 1453, the Turks actually invade, and they're able to conquer the great city of Constantinople. So that marks the more or less the demise of the Byzantine Empire. There's one other factor that's very important, and that is in the year 1204. That's the year of the fourth. The fourth, the ancient the wars that Europeans were conducting in the Middle East, the Crusades. The 1215 was the year of the Fourth Crusade, and that was the one that actually rapes and destroys the imperial city of Constantinople. That's also kind of the beginning of the end. Lots of the treasure that was there is actually brought back to Europe from that point. And it's one of the factors actually in the rise of Europe later on. So the Byzantine Empire had done well, but it comes to a sort of inglorious end. Nevertheless, it made a major contribution to the future of civilization, ideas, and so on, and that will be inherited by others, nevertheless. The second great civilization, and let's call it empire, was the Islamic Empire, Islamic civilization. And that, as you all know, begins in the 7th century with Muhammad, who claims to have had a dream. He talks about the revelation directly from Allah. And the result, of course, is going to be the Holy Book, and that's going to eventually be the Quran, which is the direct revelation of Allah to Muhammad. That becomes the text. Now, Muhammad originally starts out in one area, in Mecca, but he's not well received there. His ideas are not received. He eventually goes to another place called Medina. There he has more success, and he's able to get a lot of converts to follow him and to simply accept his ideas of the true God, of the true religion. And he's able to convert many in his area. This is essentially the Arabics area. He lived, of course, Medina, and Medina was the ancient area of Saudi Arabia, what's now Saudi Arabia. So he will become the great religious leader and to some extent political leader of the Arabs. From there, having gotten his followers, having come back and essentially conquered much of the area, his successors will take his work and will expand on that, and eventually the Islamic armies, which were very much of a convinced army, their whole work was to spread the word of Allah. And they will actually be very successful, going all the way across North Africa, coming into Spain, conquering much of Spain, getting all the way to an area in France, where they were finally stopped by a man known as Charles Martel, who was the Frankish king. That's in 732. Nevertheless, that means that the Islamic armies got all the way to Europe and all the way into France, what is now France. Going in the other direction, they made it all the way to India, and then beyond. There's even Islamic, big Muslim settlement or population in parts of China, even now. And eventually, of course, even Indonesia would become Islamic. So you know that they had great success. Why did they have success like that? It was extremely rapid. It happened, much of it, within a century. As a matter of fact, the work of Muhammad himself was accomplished in a period roughly between 610 and 630 or so, when he's able to conquer the ancient areas of Saudi Arabia. And from then, much of the Arab world is united by the new religion. What was the new religion? Why was it so popular? Well, for one thing, the ideas were held to come directly from Allah, For another thing, it promised many of the things that Christianity promised, a paradise, everlasting life, eternity. It also called upon its adherents, the believers, to take care of the poor. It welcomed everybody. Anybody could actually join into this Islamic civilization and the religion. And a number of rituals were associated with this, and those rituals, by the way, became known as the Hadith, which was in addition to the Quran. So you have a body of rituals, you have a body, you have a text, which is based on divine revelation, and there were several pillars of Islam that were developed. One of them was that you should pray, turn toward Mecca, and you should pray 5 times a day to Allah. Allah was held to be the one and only God. Allah was the foundation of all wisdom, of the moral order. Allah would grant one's entry into paradise. Allah was the basis of law. So it was an all-embracing religion. And in fact, the model was actually theocracy. And Islam, state, religion, morality, law, all come together in a way that is not true in Western society, where we have more or less now a secular state, absolute division of church and state, and so on and so forth. So Islam develops a number of things that become very integral. One is, as I said, you would pray 5 times a day, turning toward Mecca. If you ever go to the great city of Istanbul, you can still hear the call. The first call is at 6 in the morning. It's quite an amazing thing, and of course the great mosques that have been built since the time of Muhammad are also, if you ever get to Istanbul, you'll want to go to the Blue Mosque and others as well. So beyond prayer, one should, as I said, give alms to the poor. Everybody is supposed to make at least one pilgrimage during their lifetime to Mecca. Generally speaking, one should simply observe, read the Quran. One should simply follow the laws of Islam. And as I said, Islamic law is based directly on Allah, and essentially that one should not worship anybody else beyond Allah. Beyond this becomes sort of the basis of religion. In the 7th century, there will be a split within Islam, and everybody who reads newspapers knows about that now, between the Shia and the Sunni. The Sunni were always the majority. They were more traditionalist than the Shia. The Shia tend to be many of the poor communities now, but historically they believe that the succession to Muhammad should be directly through his, Muhammad Ali, who was the son-in-law and also a cousin of Muhammad, and that the true caliphs would be the ones who were the direct descendants. So that's the difference between them in terms of how their outlook. Islam is different in many ways, obviously, than Christianity. Muhammad is not held to be a divine savior at all, or a messianic figure. He is the last and the greatest prophet. That's how they see it, but nevertheless the great leader of Islam. Islam will be also a very dynamic culture. As I said, it was able to conquer many territories very rapidly, and perhaps would have gone on to even greater success. There is actually a kind of Islamic Renaissance, and that occurs in the 13th century, 12th, 13th century, in Baghdad. And Baghdad was probably, if not certainly one of, and maybe the most dynamic center of learning and culture, and certainly in all of the West, and maybe entirely in the world, but in any case, certainly one of the great centers. Learning was very, very developed. Many of the ancient Greek texts were actually translated into Arabic, and really they were thriving in terms of development of mathematics and science. Hard to say, but had Islamic civilization not succumbed to the waves of intrusions that came into the empire at that point, it might very well have developed in a direction that would have gone towards science. But in any case, it's important to at least remember that the Arabs really developed an extraordinarily dynamic civilization. Why didn't it continue? Well, a number of reasons. There were, again, the Crusades, to go back to those. Those were They made many incursions into the Middle East where many Arabs were living, and that certainly helped lead to some of the decline. But I'd say that for the most part, it was again the Turks who came, again the Seljuks, and of course then later the Ottoman Turks, and they would eventually take over, in fact, the entire Middle East, or what is today the Middle East. So the Islamic civilization, great as it was, is actually going to succumb to yet another intrusion from yet another culture. And of course the Ottomans will dominate this area all the way until World War I. They'll lose some of their territory, but they will remain there. One other thing, and that is that when the Ottomans do come, they themselves will actually convert to Islam, and of course they will accept the Sunni branch of it all. But in any case, let's take a look now at the third culture, dynamic culture that it was, and that is Europe. Europe was in chaos, as we might remember, and with the collapse of Rome, it's hard to really have predicted that it would ever rise from the ashes, but it did. And it became as dynamic or more dynamic than perhaps other cultures in the West. So why did that happen? Well, first of all, Christianity was a factor itself, because with the disappearance of centralized control, with the disappearance of the Roman Empire, with the disappearance of the Roman administration, and sort of political authority, you might say, there could have been easily chaos, but Christianity prevails. Christianity continues. And as Christianity has success, that helps to some extent preserve some of the ancient culture of the old world. And it might sound like, and perhaps you've heard, that when Christianity came, well, that was the end of Greek culture. That was the end of the ancient culture of Greek philosophy, let's say. But nevertheless, that's not entirely true, because what Christianity does, first of all, it helps unify Europe linguistically as well as religiously, beginning with St. Patrick, who converts Ireland. Monasteries continue to be in existence. Monasteries will be instrumental in converting Europe to Christianity. And among those efforts, of course, are the successful efforts to actually convert the Germanic tribes, the Germans, who managed to impose their political authority on virtually all of Europe, with the exception of Scandinavia. That's where the Vikings, of course, were dominant. Well, so you have a certain amount of continuity, and Christianity certainly makes its mark there and helps because of the preservation of learning, translation, and not just religious texts, but other texts as well. All right, so how does Europe revive then? If you go to the Franks, they were the ones who actually came into what is now France, and so Franks, the name France actually comes from the Franks. The German word for France is Frankreich. The Franks will be the ones to sort of impose some order, beginning as early as a king. He becomes king by the name of Clovis. He becomes the first, really, to sort of impose some authority on much of central France. Not an easy thing to do. And what he does, he not only is able to do that, but in the year 496, he accepts Christianity. He actually converts to Christianity. So there is this kind of marriage early on that Christianity gives some sort of protection, you might say, or legitimacy to the king, and at the same time, the king recognizing Christianity. Christianity is sort of, in a way, on its way to becoming an almost official state religion. That will certainly happen over the next few centuries. After Clovis, the kingdom of France, or the Franks, does disintegrate a little bit. There are many quarrels within the so-called royal family, but it's going to change, and it begins to change at the end of the 7th century. Pepin II manages to reimpose some authority, and his son in particular has a lot of success, and that's Charles Martel. Charles Martel will be the ruler of the kingdom between 714 and 741, and what he does, it's in the year 732, which I mentioned before. In the year 732, Martel is actually able to repulse the Islamic invasion of the Frankish kingdom. And how does he do that? He's got to raise an army. He raises an army by essentially establishing feudalism. That is to say that if they call them aristocrats, they were called counts, if they will simply essentially pay service or give service to the state, essentially serving as a kind of army, they in turn would be privileged within the state. So it's a sort of mutual dependency, and that is exactly what feudalism becomes, right? The king needs the counts in order to put together a state, collect taxes, raise an army, and the counts, of course, need a king in order to preserve their power within the kingdom. From there, it grows quite a bit. His successor is Pippin III. Pippin III reaches some sort of an understanding with the church, and in 754, the Pope at that time even comes to ask for help from Pippin. He wants the German tribe, which is there, Lombards, to be repulsed and to be more or less defeated, because he wants that territory for himself to claim it for the church. And this is something that will happen. So Pippin actually does invade Italy, grants the Pope this concession of it's called the donation of Pippin. And the Lombard territory, that is territory in Italy, is actually granted to the papacy. So here's a great thing. So the papacy has acknowledged the authority, the imperial kind of throne of Pippin, and Pippin has acknowledged the Christianity as a sort of official religion. That work continues with his son, the great Charles the Great, or Charlemagne as he was known. In 800, he actually takes the imperial crown. He puts it on his own head, apparently, but he takes the imperial crown from Leo III, Pope Leo III, and puts it on his head, and that establishes that the church is legitimizing him as the great emperor, right? And he's German. He is the head of the Frankish kingdom at that time. He will have enormous success expanding out this kingdom, conquering much of Germany, conquering southern, northern Italy, conquering much of Europe again, with the exception of Western and Central Europe, with the exception of Scandinavia. So here again, you have the church and Charlemagne kind of vindicating each other, bringing together a sort of a stability, each acknowledging the authority of the other, and that's really helpful in terms of unifying Europe, establishing some stability. The Frankish kings, by the way, based their authority on Roman law. They used Roman law, they used the Roman system of administration, the Roman system of taxation, and that is what kind of held Europe together, and that's what gave it a kind of legality as well. And the fact that the Germans had accepted Christianity, of course, made everything possible. Now, after Charlemagne, the kingdom begins to be divided. His three sons, they each take a part of the kingdom, and not only that, then the kingdom is again subject to a lot of invasions from the east, the Magyars, Hungarians, from the north, the Vikings, from the Mediterranean, the Arabs, and so the kingdom goes through a period of relative insecurity, and it could very easily have happened that Europe falls apart. It doesn't fall apart. What is the reason for that? The reason for that is the institution of feudalism that I talked about a little bit before. Feudalism helps really stabilize all of Europe at this point. And feudalism, by creating a system of mutual interdependency, people depend on each other. Peasants need protection from their lords. The lords need help from the peasants, etc., etc. When you put all that together, even as central authority begins to disappear, it's the system of mutual interdependency that helps Europe get through all of the invasions and eventually is going to lead to its thriving. So the institution of feudalism, which includes manorialism and all sorts of things, villages which seem scattered, which seem independent, it's really not quite true, because all of these things come together in this system, vast system, network of interdependency, and that is what allows Europe to survive and to struggle through for a better day. Thank you, and next time we will continue our talk.